I never imagined that my life could change so suddenly, so drastically. My quiet apartment, which had once been my sanctuary, became the scene of constant chaos. It all started the day Michael, my older brother, called with the news that would turn my world upside down. "Emma, I need a place to stay," his voice crackled through the phone, desperation thick in every word. "I've lost everything, and Sarah and we don't have anywhere else to go." Of course I told him yes. How could I not? He was my brother and family was family, even though we hadn't exactly been close for years. His recent divorce from his wealthy in-laws had left him stranded, and his proud nature prevented him from seeking any real help from anyone else. 2 days later, Michael and Sarah arrived, their baby in tow. Tommy, their newborn son, was barely a few months old. He looked so small and fragile in Sarah's arms, his face scrunched up in that way babies do when they're uncomfortable. The first thing I noticed as they walked into my apartment was how much space they seemed to occupy. Michael, with his broad shoulders and overpowering presence, seemed to consume the air around him. Sarah followed, her eyes tired but sharp, as if constantly on alert. And then there was Tommy, who cried the moment the door closed, his tiny voice echoing through the apartment. At first, I tried to be understanding. Told myself I would adjust. After all, how hard could it be? It was just a few weeks, maybe a month, until they got back on their feet. I even gave up my bedroom to set up a nursery for Tommy. What followed was something I hadn't expected. A complete disruption of my entire routine. The moment my bedroom was transformed into a nursery, I felt a pang of loss. The room that had once been a peaceful haven for me was now filled with the clattering sounds of baby toys, the faint smell of baby powder, and the constant murmur of Sarah and Michael arguing about everything from the temperature of the room to whose turn it was to change Tommy's diaper. I had to be patient, but it wasn't easy. I was still working full-time, coming home exhausted each night only to find dishes piled high in the sink, toys scattered across the floor, and laundry overflowing from the hamper. The place that had once been my sanctuary now felt more like a battlefield. I had to step around the mess just to get to the couch. What was now my bed? It didn't help that Michael spent most of his days moping around the apartment, complaining about his in-laws and reminiscing about the glory days when he had been a successful businessman. His words were empty, a constant reminder of what he had lost, and what he wasn't willing to do to get it back. Meanwhile, Sarah, overwhelmed by the demands of a newborn and a husband who refused to step up, spent her days either crying or arguing with Michael. The tension was thick in the air, and Tommy could feel it. He cried all the time. One evening, after another frustrating day of cleaning and cooking for them, I reached my breaking point. I needed to do something to help Michael, to get him out of this slump. I was tired of being the only one making an effort, and it was clear that he wasn't going to do anything unless he had a push. "Michael," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral, "we actually have some openings at my company. I could put in a good word for you with HR. The benefits are great and the starting salary is decent." He looked up from his phone, his face twisting into a grimace. "An entry-level position? Are you kidding me? I'm a businessman, Emma. I don't do entry-level. I need an executive position, something worthy of my experience." I could feel my blood boiling, but I kept my voice calm. "Your experience running a business into the ground." The words slipped out before I could stop them. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael's face turned red. "You don't know anything about what happened. That was my in-laws' fault. They set me up to fail." I didn't respond. He stormed off to his room, my old room. I was left standing there, wondering how much longer I could live like this. Would this nightmare ever end? Little did I know, things were about to get worse. The next few weeks felt like an eternity. Despite my best efforts to maintain some semblance of normalcy, I could feel myself unraveling. The apartment, once my peaceful refuge, was now a constant source of stress. Michael and Sarah's presence loomed large, and I found it impossible to escape the chaos. The endless arguments, the crying baby, the ever-growing pile of dirty dishes. It all became too much to bear. Michael, despite his constant complaining about his in-laws and the loss of his glory days, refused to take responsibility for anything. His failure to adjust to reality was infuriating. He spent his days sulking, blaming everyone but himself for his downfall, while Sarah struggled to keep things together. It wasn't long before their constant bickering became the soundtrack of my life. Every day felt like an uphill battle, and I was losing the war. Tommy, their baby, seemed to be feeding off the tension in the apartment. He cried constantly, and no one seemed to be able to calm him down. It was a cycle that I couldn't escape. I would come home from work, exhausted, only to be greeted by a mess, dishes stacked high, clothes scattered around, and toys strewn everywhere. The apartment had become a war zone, and I was the only one left to pick up the pieces. The first few days, I ignored the mess, hoping things would settle down. But the dirty dishes attracted ants, and the clutter made it impossible to relax. I couldn't even sit on the couch without stepping on a stray toy or dirty laundry. I was constantly cleaning up after them, cooking meals that were often devoured before I had a chance to eat them. It was like I was invisible, my needs completely disregarded. One evening, after a particularly draining day at work, I decided to try something different. Maybe it was time to offer Michael a real solution, something that could get him back on his feet. I needed him to start taking responsibility for his own life, instead of relying on me, or worse, my parents. Pick up the pieces. Michael, I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the frustration bubbling inside me. I know things are tough right now, but we actually have some openings at my company. I could put in a good word for you with HR. The benefits are great and the starting salary is decent. He glanced up from his phone, his face twisting in indignation. An entry-level position. Are you kidding me? I'm a businessman, Emma. I don't do entry-level jobs. I need something high-level, something worthy of my experience. I took a deep breath, holding back the retort that was on the tip of my tongue. Your experience running a business into the ground. I muttered under my breath, but not quietly enough. His face turned bright red. You don't know anything about what happened. It was my in-laws' fault. They set me up to fail, he yelled, storming off to my old bedroom. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. How had I ended up in this situation? How had it come to this? They had moved in only a few weeks ago, but it felt like a lifetime. I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I could go on like this. The apartment was a mess, my privacy was gone, and I was carrying the weight of everything. I was financially responsible for everything, and yet they contributed nothing. It wasn't just about the mess anymore. It wasn't just about the stress. It was about the realization that this was never going to change unless I took matters into my own hands. I couldn't continue living this way, sacrificing my comfort, my peace, my happiness for people who refused to help themselves. As the days dragged on, I knew I couldn't keep ignoring the toll this situation was taking on me. My patience was wearing thin, and I could feel the breaking point approaching. A financial strain alone was unbearable, and I hadn't even started to confront the emotional toll of it all. I needed a solution, and fast. It was time to call my parents. The thought filled me with dread, but it was the only way to make them understand the reality of the situation. I needed them to see that I couldn't keep carrying this burden on my own. But when the conversation began, I quickly realized that I wasn't going to get the sympathy I expected. Mom, Dad, we need to talk about the living situation, I said, trying to remain calm. Michael and Sarah aren't contributing anything to the household expenses. They're eating all my food, using utilities that I pay for. This isn't sustainable. My mom's voice was sharp, cutting me off before I could continue. I can't believe how selfish you're being, Emma. Your brother lost everything. His in-laws betrayed him. He has a baby to take care of. You need to be more understanding. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to snap. But that's just it, Mom. I'm not just helping. I'm carrying the entire financial burden. They don't buy groceries. They don't do anything. Mom's tone softened, but it only made me feel worse. Your brother is going through a difficult time. This isn't forever. You need to be more understanding. I didn't know how much more I could take. The weight of it all was too much. The rent, the food, the cleaning, it was all on me, and no one seemed to care. I needed to take control, or I was going to lose myself in the process. That night, I started looking for apartments. I knew it was time to make a change, but what I didn't realize was how quickly that change would come. The next few days were a blur of frustration and exhaustion. The pressure to keep everything afloat was weighing heavily on me, and the sense of hopelessness grew with each passing hour. Michael and Sarah's constant bickering and Tommy's nonstop crying were like nails on a chalkboard. I felt trapped in a never-ending cycle of chaos, with no way out. But despite the overwhelming stress, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, sacrificing my happiness for people who refused to take responsibility. I couldn't carry their burdens any longer. I needed to take back control of my life. I spent hours searching for apartments, scrolling through listings online, and calling property managers. The idea of finding a place of my own, free from the weight of their demands, felt like a distant dream. It was a dream I was determined to chase. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at work, I received a call from a property manager I had contacted earlier. "Hi, Emma. This is Julie from West End Apartments. I've got a unit available, and I think it might be a perfect fit for you. Would you like to come by and take a look?" I barely contained my excitement. "Yes, I'll be there tomorrow. Thank you so much." The next day, I arrived at the apartment complex, my heart pounding with anticipation. The building was quiet, nestled in a peaceful neighborhood, and the apartment itself was exactly what I needed: spacious, affordable, and far enough from Michael and Sarah's apartment that I wouldn't be constantly reminded of them. The moment I walked through the door of the unit, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It was mine for the taking, and I could already imagine how different my life would be if I could finally escape. This could be the fresh start I so desperately needed. But as I stood there imagining life in this new space, the reality of what it would take to leave started to sink in. I would have to make the difficult decision to tell Michael and Sarah that I was moving out. I knew it wouldn't be easy. They'd be angry, hurt, and resentful. But I couldn't keep living in their shadow, trying to make everything work while they did nothing to help themselves. That night, I sat down with Michael and Sarah. I didn't know how to say it, but I knew it had to be said. "I've found an apartment," I began, my voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "I'm moving out. I can't keep living like this anymore." Michael's face twisted in anger. "You're abandoning us? After everything we've been through? You're just going to leave us here?" Sarah, her face pale and tear-streaked, looked up at me, her voice trembling. "Emma, please don't do this. We're struggling. We need you." I felt a pang of guilt deep in my chest, but I knew this was the right decision. "I'm sorry, but I can't keep living in this toxic environment. I've tried to help, but it's not working. You need to take responsibility for your own lives." The room was filled with silence as the weight of my words sank in. Michael stood up and walked out of the room without saying another word, while Sarah collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. I felt a sharp pang of guilt, but at the same time, a sense of relief washed over me. I was finally taking control of my life, making the decision to put myself first. It was hard, but it was necessary. The next few days passed in a blur. Michael and Sarah barely spoke to me, and the tension in the apartment was palpable. But I knew that the hardest part was over. I had made the decision to move forward, to find a place where I could rebuild my life without being weighed down by their failures. On moving day, I packed up my things, each box and bag representing a step toward freedom. As I loaded up my car and drove away, I felt a surge of relief. This was my fresh start, my chance to build a life that was truly my own. As I settled into my new apartment, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent for so long. I had my space, my privacy, and the freedom to make my own choices without constantly cleaning up after others. The weight of responsibility had been lifted, and for the first time in months, I could breathe. But as I sat on the couch in my new place, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would Michael and Sarah ever get their lives together? Would they realize the consequences of their actions? And more importantly, would I ever be able to forgive myself for abandoning them when they needed me most? For now, though, all I could do was focus on myself. I had taken the first step toward a better life, and I was determined to make the most of it. The days passed slowly as I adjusted to my new life in the apartment. It felt strange at first, being alone after months of chaos. But there was an undeniable sense of relief. I could finally relax. I wasn't constantly cleaning up after others, and I didn't have to endure Michael and Sarah's endless arguments. My new apartment was a sanctuary, a place where I could unwind, focus, and regain some semblance of control over my life. But just as I started to settle in, reality hit again. It came in the form of an unexpected phone call from my mother. "Emma, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight and urgent. "There's an issue with the rent." Immediately felt a knot form in my stomach. "What do you mean, Mom? I paid the rent on time this month." "Yes, but starting next month, we're doubling it," she replied flatly. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. My mind raced as I tried to process her words. Double? But I'm already paying the full market rate. Why would the rent go up? Mom's tone didn't soften. "Well, now that Michael and Sarah are living with you, there's more wear and tear on the apartment, more utilities being used. It's only fair that the rent reflects that." "Fair?" My voice cracked with disbelief. "How is it fair that I should pay double rent when I'm forced to sleep on the couch in my own living room?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. My mother's voice became sharper. "Emma, you have a good job. You can afford it. Your brother needs time to get back on his feet. You should be more understanding." I couldn't keep quiet any longer. The anger that had been bubbling inside me for months came to a head. "You want me to pay double rent for something I didn't choose? This was your decision, not mine. Michael doesn't even pay anything toward the rent, and now I'm supposed to carry the financial burden for all of you." Mom's response was dismissive as expected. "Your brother's going through a tough time. You need to be more patient with him. This isn't forever." The conversation ended with my mother's ultimatum. I hung up the phone, my heart racing, my mind reeling from the injustice. It felt like they were deliberately pushing me to the brink, testing how much they could take from me before I broke. I couldn't help but think about how everything had escalated. What started as a minor inconvenience, having my brother and his family move in, had turned into a full-blown financial and emotional burden. And now my parents were asking me to pay for the privilege of supporting them when they hadn't contributed a single cent toward the household since they moved in. The worst part? I knew they didn't even see it as a problem. To them, I was just the reliable daughter, the one who always did the right thing, the one who would shoulder the responsibility without complaint. But I couldn't take it anymore. Later that night, after Michael and Sarah had gone to bed, I sat in my new apartment, staring at my phone screen. The apartment listings I had bookmarked were a lifeline, an escape from this financial trap I had found myself in. I felt the weight of my decision settle on my shoulders. I wasn't just leaving a bad situation. I was freeing myself from years of being taken advantage of. I needed to do something, and I needed to do it fast. I scrolled through the listings again, looking for something better, something more affordable. I found it. An apartment just down the street, modern and spacious, and most importantly, within my budget. It was perfect. I called the number immediately. "Hi, I'm interested in the unit on Maple Street. Is it still available?" The property manager confirmed that it was, and I scheduled a viewing for the next day. I couldn't waste any more time. I was going to do this. I was going to escape. As I drove to the new apartment the next day, I felt a strange mixture of anxiety and excitement. This was it. This was my chance to get out of the situation I had been stuck in for far too long. I didn't want to live like this anymore, constantly being asked to give more, to sacrifice more, with no end in sight. The apartment was everything I had hoped for. It was clean, quiet, and peaceful. No screaming baby. No constant arguments, no family members who thought I existed to fix their problems. It was mine, just mine. I signed the lease that day. I could hardly believe it. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a choice. I was taking control of my own life. But I knew the hardest part was still to come. Telling my family I was moving out would be a nightmare. I could already picture my mother's reaction. The guilt-tripping, the manipulation. Knew I'd be painted as the selfish one, the ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her family when they needed her most. That night, I sat on my couch, my mind racing. I could no longer avoid the inevitable. I had to face them and make it clear that I was done. I was done being the one to clean up their messes, to carry the financial burden, to sacrifice my happiness for their comfort. It was time for me to put myself first, no matter how hard it was, and I knew that once I made the decision, I wouldn't look back. The decision was made, and I couldn't back out now. But the weight of it all settled on my chest like a stone. Moving out of the apartment where I had been stuck for so long felt like breaking free from chains, but it also felt like I was about to rip apart my family in the process. The next few days were a blur. I packed my belongings, cleaned up the apartment, and prepared for the confrontation. I had no idea how they would react, but I knew it wouldn't be good. My family wasn't used to me standing up for myself. They were used to me quietly enduring whatever they threw my way. Finally, the day came when I had to face them. I could hear the sounds of Michael and Sarah talking in the living room, their voices muffled but unmistakable. My stomach churned and my hands trembled as I stood by the door, trying to summon the courage to walk in and tell them the truth. I had spent too long keeping my feelings bottled up, pretending everything was fine, but it wasn't fine. I couldn't keep playing the role of the dutiful daughter while they walked all over me. It was time to stop being the martyr. I walked into the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. Michael looked up, surprised to see me standing there. "What's up, Emma?" he asked, but there was an edge to his tone as if he already sensed something was off. I took a deep breath. "I'm moving out," I said, the words sounding foreign on my lips, but resolute. Michael blinked, processing my statement. "What do you mean? You're moving out? Why?" I could hear the frustration creeping into his voice, and Sarah's face twisted with confusion. She looked at me like I was crazy. "Emma, you can't just leave. We need you here. We've been through a lot, and you're the one who's been holding everything together." "That's the problem," I replied, my voice steady but firm. "I've been holding everything together for so long that I forgot what it felt like to live for myself. I'm not your support system anymore." There was a silence that hung in the air, thick with tension. Michael's face flushed with anger. "So what? You're just going to abandon us?" Shook my head. "It's not abandonment. It's about taking care of myself. I can't keep sacrificing my happiness for everyone else. I've done it for years, and it's enough." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but I held up my hand, cutting her off. "I'm done. I'm moving out, and I'm not going to apologize for it. This is something I need to do for myself." Michael's jaw tightened, and his voice dropped to a low, menacing tone. "You're making a mistake, Emma. You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," I replied, my voice unwavering. "And I'm doing it for me." With that, I turned and walked out of the room, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders with every step I took. The battle had been fought. The decision had been made. As I drove to my new apartment that afternoon, I felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. It was over. I had finally broken free. But at what cost? Would they ever understand? Would they forgive me? The thought lingered, but I knew one thing for certain. I had done what I needed to do. I wasn't going to keep sacrificing myself for them anymore. It was time to live for me. And as I stood in my new apartment, alone but free, I felt a spark of hope that I hadn't felt in years. It was the beginning of something new, something just for me. And for the first time in a long while, I believed that I was finally where I was supposed to be. The first few weeks in my new apartment were blissful. I woke up without hearing the constant wail of Tommy, the baby's cries that had filled my old apartment. I didn't have to worry about cleaning up after anyone or making sure the dishes were done before ants started marching across the counter. For the first time in months, my apartment was quiet, clean, and peaceful. I took time to adjust to this new life, relishing in the solitude. I bought a comfortable bed that I didn't have to share, a cozy couch that I could finally relax on without it doubling as a bed, and a small dining table where I could eat in peace. Each meal was mine to savor without fear that it would disappear before I had a chance to enjoy it. But as the days passed, the reality of what I had done began to settle in. My phone remained silent for a while, but then, like clockwork, it rang one evening. The caller ID read Mom. I hesitated before answering. Emma. Her voice was tight, tinged with irritation. We need to talk. I sighed, bracing myself. About what? About your rent, she said, her tone more demanding now. You haven't paid yet. I rolled my eyes, feeling my patience wear thin. You know what the agreement was. Double rent. You and Dad still think that's fair. She didn't even try to mask the tension. That's not the point. Your family, Emma. Your brother needs help, and you're refusing to contribute. My jaw tightened. Mom, I'm not refusing. I'm paying my own way. I'm not supporting Michael's laziness anymore. Don't speak about your brother like that, she snapped, her voice growing louder. He's been through a lot. You can't just leave him hanging. I'd hear her sigh deeply on the other end, the sound of her pacing. Emma, we raised you better than this. You don't turn your back on family. I'm not turning my back, Mom, I said, my voice firm but calm. I'm taking care of myself for once. I'm not going to let Michael keep using me as a crutch. He's an adult and he needs to take responsibility. The silence on the other end was thick with disbelief, but I could hear the faint sound of her trying to compose herself. You don't know what he's going through. You're being selfish. I'm not being selfish, I said. I've been giving, and he's been taking. That's not healthy for either of us. Well, you'll regret this, she said, her voice trembling with anger. I'll let you go now. The call ended abruptly, and I sat there for a moment, staring at the phone in my hand. The weight of what I had just said hit me. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but there was no turning back now. The following days were tense. I avoided answering their calls, and when they did get through, it was always a confrontation. They weren't asking me for help anymore. They were demanding it. Michael had grown bolder, his attitude becoming more entitled. It didn't help that Sarah was now using the baby as an emotional weapon, reminding me at every opportunity that I was family and should be there for them. The pressure mounted. One evening, I got a call from my grandparents, who were the only ones still trying to see things from my perspective. They let me know what was going on back at the apartment, and I could feel the smug satisfaction in their voices as they updated me on the situation. My parents were doing exactly what I feared, paying for everything. Michael wasn't looking for work. He wasn't even trying. And my parents were covering the rent, utilities, and even providing spending money. It was becoming clear that my decision to leave had sent them into a downward spiral they hadn't anticipated. But I couldn't feel sorry for them. Not anymore. I wasn't the one who had put them in this position. They had chosen to treat me like the bank, using me to fund their mistakes, all while shielding Michael from the consequences of his actions. As much as I had hoped they'd see things my way, I knew now that I was on my own. I couldn't change their mindset, and I couldn't go back to being the person they expected me to be. And while it hurt, while the guilt gnawed at me, I also knew that I was doing the right thing. This was the first time in my life I was standing up for myself, setting boundaries, and it was hard. But it felt necessary. I looked around my new apartment, a peaceful solitude I had craved for so long, and realized something important. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was finally living for myself, and that was worth every bit of the fallout. A month passed since I moved out, and with each passing day, I felt more certain that I had made the right choice. The silence in my new apartment became a comforting presence, the kind of peace I hadn't known in years. My coworkers noticed a change too. I was sharper, more focused. It wasn't just the absence of stress from living with my brother and his family. It was the newfound energy I had to put into myself. I was thriving, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had control over my own life. But that calm didn't last. The phone rang one afternoon at work, and I immediately recognized the number. Mom. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks. After the last conversation, I had blocked her number, but I could still see the missed calls on my phone. I let it go to voicemail. The message that followed was predictable. Emma, she began, her voice tight, we need to talk. Your father and I are doing everything we can to help Michael. But he's still not able to pay his bills. You have to understand, he needs us right now. I gripped the phone tightly, frustration bubbling inside me. It was always the same thing. Michael's problems had to be my problems. My mom, as usual, was blind to the reality that he wasn't trying. He wasn't learning from his mistakes. And they, in turn, weren't helping him by enabling him. A deep breath and replied, my voice steady but firm. I'm not getting involved anymore. Can't keep supporting his choices. Her voice cracked, full of hurt. Emma, don't you care about your brother? Don't you care about family? The word family echoed in my ears. Had spent my entire life being the reliable one, the one everyone leaned on. But now, for the first time, I was saying no. And it was harder than I thought. It wasn't just about my brother. It was about my parents' manipulation, their unwillingness to acknowledge how toxic their behavior was. I care, Mom, but I also care about myself now. I'm not your safety net anymore. The line went silent for a moment and I could almost hear her scrambling for words. You're being cruel, she finally whispered. I felt the guilt begin to crawl under my skin, but I fought it. I'm not being cruel, I'm being honest. You've spent my whole life treating me like the fallback plan. But I'm done. I'm not living like this anymore. I ended the call before she could respond. For the next few hours I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to the conversation. My mom's words lingered in my head. You're being cruel. Was I, or was I just finally standing up for myself? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt gnawing at my insides. It was like a weight pressing down on my chest. I had made my choice, but it didn't make the pain go away. I had to remind myself that this wasn't about being cruel. It was about survival. The next day, I came home to find a message waiting for me on my phone. It was from Michael of all people. Emma, I'm sorry, he wrote. I know things have been rough and I've been in a hole, but I really need you right now. I can't find work and Sarah's been stressing me out with the baby. Can't you just help us out? Please, we'll make it up to you. I read the message over and over again. The apology felt hollow. He was still asking for help without taking responsibility for his own actions. I wanted to respond, wanted to tell him that I was done enabling him, but I knew it wouldn't matter. He'd just keep using the same excuses. The baby, Sarah, his broken dreams. Instead, I deleted the message. I didn't even bother replying. Michael had made his choices, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. I couldn't keep fixing things for him. Later that week, I received another call from Mom, but this time I didn't pick up. Instead, I'd opened my email, scrolled through a few job listings, and signed up for a freelance project. I was finally focusing on me. The noise from my family, the guilt trips, the expectations, they could all wait. I was putting my needs first, and I knew that was the right thing to do. There would be no more bailouts, no more taking responsibility for others' mistakes. For once, I was going to live life on my own terms. And if that meant standing firm and never looking back, then so be it. 6 months had passed since I moved out of that suffocating apartment, and every single day since had been a reminder that I had made the right choice. My new life felt like a breath of fresh air, free from the chaos, guilt, and manipulation that had ruled my days. I had rebuilt my life, brick by brick, and there was no going back. It wasn't easy though. The phone calls from my mom had tapered off, but the guilt still lingered. Every time I saw her number flash on my screen, I wondered if this time would be different, if she'd finally get it. But I had learned not to respond. My new life was mine, and no one could take that away. Then one afternoon, I got a message from my grandmother. It was short and to the point. "I just want you to know that your parents are still covering Michael's rent. They haven't paid a dime since you left." I felt a sickening mixture of anger and vindication. Michael, Sarah, and the baby were still living in my old apartment. Mom and Dad were still covering the bills, still enabling Michael's irresponsible behavior. And the worst part? My brother still hadn't found a job. His executive aspirations had led him nowhere, and it seemed like his life was one long string of failed attempts. I didn't even feel sorry for him anymore. He had made his bed. It was time he lay in it. I didn't dwell on it long. I had my own life now. I'd had my promotion at work, my MBA classes, my quiet evenings spent in my own apartment, and I was finally happy. But the thought of my parents continuing to give Michael money and resources in the same irresponsible way they'd always done, it made my blood boil. It wasn't my problem anymore though. One day, while walking through the grocery store, I ran into Sarah's cousin. She was with her 2 young children, and we exchanged pleasantries. We didn't talk much about the past, but as I was about to leave, she casually mentioned something that stopped me in my tracks. "They're expecting another baby," she said with a smile, almost like it was something to celebrate. I forced a smile back, nodding politely, but inside I was fuming. Another baby? Wasn't one enough? How could they keep doing this? They were living off my parents' generosity while planning for more expenses they couldn't afford. The whole thing was a farce. As I walked back to my car, the thought of it all weighed heavily on me. I had finally found peace. The chaos I had left behind was still spilling over into my parents' lives. I couldn't control that though. They had chosen this life. They had decided to continue enabling Michael and his family, and now they would have to face the consequences of their actions. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something. I had been so focused on fixing everything for everyone else that I'd forgotten about myself. Now, for the first time in my life, I was living for me. It was liberating. I wasn't going to be anyone's fallback plan anymore. I could see the future clearly now. I was going to continue to grow, both personally and professionally. I would keep working hard for my MBA, keep climbing the ladder at work, and most importantly, keep investing in myself. The satisfaction of knowing I was finally putting myself first was indescribable. Months later, I saw my mom at a family gathering. She gave me that same look, the one she always gave me when she was trying to manipulate me into feeling guilty. She'd opened her mouth to say something, but I stopped her before she could start. "I'm happy, Mom," I said, my voice steady. "And I don't need your approval to keep living my life the way I want. Michael has to figure things out, and I'm not going to be the one who fixes his problems anymore." Her face hardened, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to apologize anymore. The truth was out. For once, I was at peace. The weeks that followed were quieter. No more calls from my parents demanding rent money, no more guilt trips, no more pressure. Life had become a lot simpler, and for the first time, I could breathe without feeling like I was suffocating under the weight of other people's expectations. And then one day, I got a letter in the mail from my old apartment. It was a final notice about rent payments. It was addressed to Michael. I threw it in the trash without a second thought. Let him figure it out. I had long since moved on. I was living my life now, and nothing or no one was going to take that away from me. My parents were still stuck in their patterns, but I wasn't going to be their scapegoat anymore. Had learned that sometimes the best way to help someone is by letting them face the consequences of their actions.